The 1920s saw a series of social reform campaigns involving children, most due to long-running conditions like child labor and education. Similarly, there had been debate over whether or not unaccompanied children should be allowed to go to movie theaters. This debate was reignited after one fateful incident that would shake up the city of Montreal. This is the story of the Laurier Palace Theatre. The Laurier Palace Theatre was located on St. Catherine Street, Montreal, in Quebec Province, the largely French-speaking section of Canada. It was originally used for French plays and only started showing movies in the mid-1920s. The day is January 9, 1927, in the early afternoon. The audience numbered around 1,000, about 250 of which were children, most of them unaccompanied. There had actually been a law at the time forbidding unaccompanied children under the age of 16 to go to movie theaters, but many, if not most of the theaters in the area ignored the law. The floor section was largely occupied by adults, while the balcony seats were mostly occupied by children. A number of children also stood in the aisles. Before the feature film, an enjoyable Stan Laurel short called Get 'Em Young was shown as some light fare. During this short, a fire broke out under the floor of the balcony. There were multiple theories as to the cause, but the most common one was a discarded cigarette, perhaps from one of the adults in the audience, or perhaps from a teenager. Whatever the case, when the smoke was noticed coming up through the floorboards, someone shouted, "Le feu! Le feu! Fire! Fire!" and the audience panicked, all rushing to the exits at once. Those in the floor seats were mostly able to exit the building quickly. A number of employees, apparently inadequately trained for such situations, focused on ripping up the floorboards in the balcony to put out the fire instead of guiding the patrons out of the building safely. But exposing the fire only made it larger, and it soon got out of control. According to one account, the ushers actually blocked one of the balcony exits while the fire was still small, telling everyone that everything was under control, but they were pushed aside. The stairs leading down from the balcony were sectioned off. One survivor later described them like this. It was one of those looping stairways, 5 steps, then a landing, another 5 steps, another landing, and so on. But near the bottom, it narrowed. The stairs also turned at a 90-degree angle, which was especially dangerous in a situation like this. Some reports said that some adults used their bulk to their advantage and trampled over the children at the balcony exit to escape. One man who got out of the building immediately went to the ticket window and demanded his money back instead of trying to help. Because of how narrow the area and the balcony exit was, the panicking mass of people were jammed together, unable to move. More smoke billowed throughout the building as the fire spread. The mass of people got taller and taller, as some tried to clamber over others, only to get stuck higher up as well, those on the top reaching almost to within about a foot of the ceiling. A fire station was just across the street, only 300 feet away from the Laurier. Rescue efforts were described by the Montreal Gazette like this. Holes were chopped through the wooden stairs, directly under the jam of bodies. Another hole was made in a wall. Firemen formed in a human chain, and gradually undermined the mass by extracting those jammed. Nearly all pulled out of the stairway were dead. 2 or 3 boys gave their names and died, crushed and mangled. Outside, the police worked feverishly. While motor fire pumps roared in ear-splitting cacophony as the interior blaze was attacked with tons of water, doctors were summoned. Frail little bodies were laid in rows on the sidewalk. Priests were on the scene, and the last rites were given to a few choking little ones who revived in the open air, then died. There were heroes, however. One of these was the projectionist, a man named Émile Macleod. He kept the film going until no one was left on the balcony in order to try and keep everyone calm. Then, going down the stairway, he saw the horrific situation at the balcony exit, and forced open a window leading to the top of the entrance marquee, saving 26 children in the process. Despite the close proximity of the fire station and the quick response from firemen and policemen, the dangerous combination of unpreparedness, poor safety measures, and unsafe building design had taken its toll. Nearby police stations and fire stations were converted into temporary morgues to accommodate the surprisingly high number of dead. Others who still had a chance of living were sent to the nearest hospitals, though not all of them made it through either. One report stated that the tragedy had lasted only 10 minutes. In all, 78 children died, most of them between the ages of 6 and 16. They all came from the balcony section, where there had been a total of 150, making the death rate more than half. One of the youngest victims, a 6-year-old boy named Gaston Arpin, was the son of one of the firefighters who arrived at the scene. And in another heartbreaking story, an off-duty police constable named Albert Boisseau had rushed to the scene, suspecting that his own children had gone to the theater. Unfortunately, they had, and all 3 of them died in the tragedy. They were his only children. Another family also lost 3 children that day. For the youngest of the 3, a girl named Sylvia Quintal, it had been her first, and ultimately her only, movie experience. In the immediate aftermath, 76 of the 78 victims' cause of death had been determined. 60 had died of asphyxiation, 11 had been crushed, and 5 were burned. And an additional 30 people were injured. For comparison, the Bath School massacre later that same year killed 45 people, mostly children as well. But of course, the circumstances were very different. Immediately, there was a search for who would be held responsible for the tragedy at the Laurier Palace Theatre. The owner of the theater was a Syrian man named Amin Lawand. It was difficult to find out much about him aside from what was included in newspapers and magazine articles, and I had no luck in finding a photo of him. Lawand and a few others were taken into custody. He was charged with allowing unaccompanied children under the age of 16 into the theater. His bail was set, and he paid it. But this was not the first time Lawand had been caught breaking the law. He had previously been convicted a number of times for, among other things, overcrowding his other theaters. What's more is that he also admitted that there had been fires in another of his theaters, and in a bowling alley he owned, and even in his own house. The disaster at the Laurier Palace Theatre had some major effects in Quebec. For one, the law about unaccompanied minors would be more strictly enforced, and would last for decades more. The area would also crack down on code violations of movie theaters, to ensure that they were better prepared for dealing with emergencies. 2 months later, in mid-March, 3 Montreal theaters were forcibly closed, 5 were barred from special stage presentations due to unsafe stage conditions, and 22 were ordered to make improvements on safety features. And those numbers would continue to increase later in the month. Some local clergy used the incident to continue their campaign against showing movies on Sundays, and painted the movies as sinful and harmful to children's developing minds. Some cities already had bans on Sunday movies before the Laurier Theatre fire, one of these being the nearby town of Hull, Ontario. Some places in the US also had similar bans. But many exhibitors opposed a ban on Sunday movies because they said it was an especially profitable day of the week. Others were quick to point out that the problem was not about unaccompanied minors, but rather the preparedness of the theater and the responsibilities of both the owner and employees. But the debate would continue, and there was no real consensus on the matter. In the end, Amin Lawand was tried and convicted of manslaughter along with 2 other employees from the Laurier Theatre in October 1927. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail, and the other 2 men were sentenced to 1 year. The Laurier Palace Theatre was said to be reopening about 6 months after the fire, but it seems like it never did. A twisted bit of irony in all this is that the name of the short being shown when the fire broke out was Get 'em Young, almost as if some unknown force was playing the sickest of all jokes. And while this tragedy is largely forgotten outside of Montreal, it remains one of the darkest moments in the history of movie theaters, though unfortunately it wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. In fact, a near repeat of the same situation would occur less than 3 years later in Scotland. As I mentioned before, the Laurier Theatre fire had one especially long-lasting effect. The ban on unaccompanied children under the age of 16 going to movie theaters remained in effect in Quebec all the way until 1961. So, had you heard of this before watching this video? I just randomly came across it while looking for something else, the same way I find a lot of interesting topics for videos. When I saw how high the death toll was, I was surprised that I'd never heard of it. You probably didn't enjoy this video, but I hope you learned something interesting at least. Well, anyway, that's all for now all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.